Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Jamie Banks. I'm an associate professor in the iSchool, and I am not a technologist. I am a social scientist. And Dr. Cheva and all of the sort of socio-technical dynamic setup she just gave, I am all about the first part of that. My background is in the human communication sciences. So if we think about the traditional definition of communication, that is stimulating meaning in the mind of another. So a lot of what I work around is that meaning-making process. How do humans make sense of their interactions with different types of technologies, and in particular, social technologies? So I'm going to get into a little bit of a nitty-gritty. Sometimes in social psychology, we really dig into discrete processes. And the specific process I want to talk to you a little bit about today is the way that humans take mental shortcuts when they deal with social technologies. And as I work through this presentation today, you'll see a lot of graphics. These were all graphics that emerged out of my conversations with a tool called Midjourney. Has anybody used Midjourney before? It's pretty fun, and there's a free version, so you should check it out. But Midjourney is a Discord-based chatbot that makes the Stable Diffusion text to image technology pretty accessible and easy to use for non-technologists. So let's start out talking about the humans. Humans are lazy. We are so lazy. And in particular, our brains are lazy, right? We always take the most efficient routes to any kind of decision, unless we're really motivated to think more carefully about something, right? And so, and Midjourney is sometimes very terrible. This was supposed to be a thumb, right? We take, our brains take mental shortcuts, or what are called heuristics, or rules of thumb. And these are shortcuts that we learn through, our own experiences, that we learn through social norms, or that just become habit to us over time. How do they work? It's actually pretty simple. So we're going to boil it down to the basics here. If X, then Y. Simple if-then statement. All right, so what does that look like in the world? If you're wearing orange in this context, you are probably affiliated with SU in some sort of way. That's pretty simple, right? Okay. There's another component to it, and that is if X, then Y, therefore Z. If you're wearing orange, you're probably affiliated with SU. And if you're wearing orange, that probably means that you're better than somebody wearing some other kind of color, right? We see this with sports teams all the time, right? Don't go in the parking lot with a different color on, or you might get razzed a little bit, right? So there is this shortcut that says we're taking this set of assumptions and using them to make a decision. It's a very efficient decision, right? We don't have to think about it too hard. We don't actually have to talk to the person wearing yellow and get to know them. We can just assume that if you're orange, you're one of us, and if you're not, then you are somebody else, perhaps less interesting to talk about. And so this is the simple formula that heuristics, or that we can use to understand how heuristics function. There's some stimulus or information coming at us from our environment. It activates a mental shortcut. We often don't even realize it is happening. And that produces or can lead to some kind of biased cognitive processing, right? And I'm not talking about bias so much in the sense that Dr. Chicheva was talking about it. It's more in that it is a non-optimal, non-careful decision that we have made, right? The heuristic leans us toward one side versus necessarily thinking about all of the opportunities. We do this all the time, probably hundreds of times every day. It's not necessarily that you are being bad if you're engaged in bias processing. You're probably just not being very careful about it, right? So it can actually be good when we're dealing with social agents, this kind of bias processing. That whole shortcut, if orange, then good, or like me, right? That helps to bind people together into families, into cultures, and to help people feel safe with one another. But of course, it can also be problematic, right? Because that's the kind of processing that leads to stereotypes, effectively grouping people or perhaps other types of agents, like machine agents, into a category without necessarily thinking carefully about their unique attributes. And instead of, you just lump them in with a whole. So we're supposed to be talking about AI here. What does any of this have to do with AI? So most of the machine agents that I work with are robots. So let's just kind of muse on robots a little bit. There are robots that are being actively designed in ways that allow them to socialize with us. Not necessarily to just serve your coffee in a cafe, but to actually sit there and drink it with you, potentially. We've been talking about a little bit about AI art here today. And what if a robot actually produced art and it was exhibited alongside human art and we assigned the same kinds of value to it? There's already AI involved in the forecasting of the weather. And in some countries, there are actually embodied robots that deliver the news. And in similar countries, there are robots, social robots that have different types of cues that allow them to communicate with machines, but they play important roles, especially in elder care. And there are visions of robots being designed to help with childcare as well. So as we move into a space where social machines driven by different types of AI are increasingly becoming part of daily life. Anybody have a Roomba? So a couple of people have Roombas. People go save their Roombas. That's a social act, right? They care about their machine. Our brains are still going to be really droopy. They're going to be efficient, right? And that could be a good thing again, or it could be a problematic thing. So let's talk about some of the specific heuristics that we know exist around how people engage AI. There are a lot. We're only going to talk about a couple today. So perhaps the most frequently studied one and the most well understood is called simply the machine heuristic. And actually I got brought up in Dr. Chiteva's talk where the list that was human and the list that was machine or AI, right? So if machine, then logical, objective, ordered, reliable, accurate, and unemotional. We have been trained very well through our experiences, through the media, through advertising, to accept this premise. Right? So in some of my research on how people think about news that is produced by AI journalists, what we found there is that by simply telling a person that a news story is produced by AI, that activates and heightens the people's awareness of the machine heuristic. So if AI, then logical, reasoned, ordered. And when that goes up, people actually have a lower level of belief that the news is biased, right? We call this, there's a particular effect called hostile media bias, right? So if AI, then machine heuristic, therefore less bias. This could be awesome, right? It could help our various communities have a shared understanding of the world because we are buying into the authority of people who are supposed to be the gatekeepers of reality and the documenters of reality. It could also be problematic, right? Because this heuristic could then be weaponized for misinformation, disinformation. You would be less likely to question it if it comes from AI, or even if people say it comes from AI. So kind of the counterpoint to the machine heuristic is the nature heuristic, or also known as the naturalistic fallacy. If it is natural, then it is good and pure and wholesome. This is the heuristic that underlies the Whole Foods movement. And as also, it underlies the anti-vaxxer movement, right? Because that is not a natural thing and therefore it is bad. So we did a study, my colleagues and I, where we were testing some of the functionality of the nature and the machine heuristic. And what we did, we took one issue, and that is the decline in the bee population. And a specific slice of that is that there is a potential problem with crop pollination. And so we created this mock magazine article that was about this particular way that scientists were going to solve this problem or through some kind of mechanism. There were three. The first is that they had discovered a new kind of bee. This is an organic bee, normal, natural bee. They just discovered a new one. And the second condition, the only thing we changed in this stimulus is that we subbed out a robot bee for this natural bee. And that exists, by the way. And so does this one, which is a cyborg bee. It is a natural bee that is augmented in some kind of way to be able to solve this problem better. So what we found is that when the people who were assigned to see the natural bee, they had much higher levels of the nature heuristic. So just by seeing an organic thing, that triggers that shortcut in our brain, right? And then they thought that the solution delivered by the organic bee was much better. They gave it much more, basically they were like, yes, this is totally the way to solve the problem, compared to the cyborg bee and the robot bee. Remember, we told them that the solution we gave them was identical. We only switched out the bee they were thinking about. So the coolest thing in all of this to me, because I'm a dork for this stuff, is that so natural bee had the highest level, robot bee had the lowest level, cyborg was smack in the middle. So it's kind of this like best of both worlds. We may actually be sort of integrating in a funky way the machine heuristic and the nature heuristic. That's where it gets interesting. Right? Oops, sorry. So we're going to move away from a heuristic toward a more kind of a bigger class of bias processing, that Z part of it, in part because there's some weird stuff that happens in the heuristic that we're not entirely sure how that's working. But self-serving bias is a class of biases that basically go like, if it is something good, then it must be me. But if it's something bad, it's totally your fault, right? So think about self-driving cars. If you were in a self-driving car and you were sort of the human that's in charge of or being served by this car, depending on how you look at it, and that car hits a pedestrian, you're probably going to go into a mode where it's like, no, the car did it. The car did it, it's not my fault, right? But if you get from point A to point B and you do it fine and everything's great, you're probably like, oh, I did an excellent job piloting that self-driving car. So we actually see this in gaming entertainment tech, how people engage video games and in particular, video game characters. I've done a good deal of work in World of Warcraft. So what we see when we observe players in multiplayer environments and when they're talking out loud as they play, let's say that there is something happening in the game world, right? There's a combat effort that could go right or it could go wrong. And if we are sort of assuming here this self-serving bias because we only see the outcome, we can't ever really tell if a heuristic is activated fully, and something goes right, you're like, they use first-person pronouns. Oh, I was awesome. Did you see me do that? If it goes wrong, people start blaming their avatar. Oh, stupid thing. What is it? What are you even doing? You and it, right? Or that thing, right? It becomes objectified and it becomes the target of the blame, even though you were largely in control of that character. We have another, what is theorized to be a bias, a cognitive bias, and that is anthropomorphism. When you take a first quick glance at this, your brain wants to see a face in it, right? It's not though. It's this like ghosty thing and then two floating orbs. It is not actually a face, but there is a good deal of theorizing that we are effectively sort of programmed both through our social interactions and perhaps by evolution to see faces in things, a subset of what's called pareidolia, or seeing patterns in things in bigger sets of data, right? And this is from the Facebook group for this AI tool, Midjourney, where we see people characterizing the AI itself in very humanistic terms, right? This one's an idiot because you can't really see it. It was a little offensive, so it's cut off as far as the image that it had generated, right? It is a wonderful brutalist architect. And then, as I had mentioned, Midjourney is really terrible at drawing hands. And so they're trying to kind of make fun of it, that Midjourney is a frustrated artist because it keeps trying to draw hands and it can't do it, and damn it at the end. So finally, I want to share with you something I'm really excited about, because this is hot off the press. It's not even on the presses yet. I just submitted it to a conference. Through the course of the last 4 years of my work with the Air Force in their Trust and Influence program, I think I have discovered a novel heuristic. And it's a little bit of a complicated one, but it goes like this. If I perceive mind in a robot, in this, remember this, so this is a zero history encounter. I've never met this robot before. If I see mind in the robot, I think it has mental capacities, then I will also see it as moral and trustworthy. If I see it as moral, then I also see it as trustworthy and as having mental capacities. If I see it as trustworthy, then I will also think it has mind and morality. This makes no sense whatsoever. Think about how you deal with humans. We sort of default to assuming humans have mental capacities when we see them functioning in the world, right? But do you trust them? Right away. Normally, people have to earn trust. And we don't necessarily think that they're inherently good. They have to exhibit that to us. But when people are dealing with humanoid robots, this seems to be what is happening. Not that it's necessarily high or necessarily low, but these three things are moving together. That's kind of weird. So what we see is that I can actually simply tell you that robots could be good. We showed people this kind of doctored version of a popular science magazine. We say we invoke WALL-E because everybody loves WALL-E, and WALL-E is a good robot, right? We say, what do you know? Robot's so decent and good, it'll blow your mind. Okay, we just showed them this, and we said, this is actually unrelated. We just want you to sort of rate these different magazine articles. And then they would effectively be primed to think about the possibility of robots being good. And that would activate this, what I call a moral mind heuristic. And all of these judgments stick together rather than people thinking about them carefully. And when that was high, it actually increased the likelihood. This is the robot that I work with in my lab. It increased the likelihood that people would feel close to this robot and would be willing to engage in different kinds of close activities, more intimate conversations, being more physically close, and potentially having a closer kind of relationship with that robot. So I'm pretty excited about that. So those are just some of the heuristics that people engage machine agents, social machines with. But I do want to give us some credit. We're not always super lazy, or our brains aren't, right? So what we see when I ask people to think aloud about how they're thinking about these social machines, there is a good deal of literacy. And these are not iSchool people, these are kind of general public. There's a good amount of literacy that machines are made. And I call it the conspicuous but absent creator. When I ask them to think about, because moral judgments are a big part of the work that I do, is this robot good or bad? They're like, well, it kind of depends who made it and what are their motivations. So I have been increasingly impressed about how the everyday individual is starting to think about these things. When we think, I mentioned stereotyping with respect to these mental shortcuts. When it comes to robots, there's a lot of discourse around the gendering and the racializing of these types of social machines. I did an investigation where in my robot you can project different types of cues, and it can have different types of voices. So we did dark skin and light skin cues, and female and male tone voices, higher and lower tone voices, and looked for specific indicators of stereotyping of the robot. They weren't there. People did not differently stereotype as far as roles and traits. Instead, across all of the different variations that we had people encounter, they stereotyped the robot as an intelligent helper. They were stereotyping it as a robot, right? So there are still these very critical engagements, even among non-experts, that are not sort of buying in always to many of these opportunities to process heuristically. And then my most favorite, because it cracks me up every time, is how people deal with the mind in the machine. how they perceive the machine as having mental capacities. So across a couple of studies now, I'm going to call it like 700 participants in different formats. People will behave in ways that suggest that they're inferring mental states in the robot. One of the classic indicators is called the mind in the eye, as part of a test suite called the tacit. And basically what that looks like is we have a machine exhibit a particular facial expression. And then I ask the person, what adjective would you use to describe that robot's internal state? Let's say the robot is frowning. They go, oh, well, that robot's sad. Sad is an emotion word, right? I'm not even telling you to say mental state or how do they feel or anything like that. People are still coming up with emotion words to describe the internal states of machines. We're kind of programmed to do this, right? To take on these social cues. And so people will repeatedly, there's a bunch of different indicators that people are doing this where we don't have to actually ask them directly. But then when we do ask them directly, they're like, oh no, of course it could not have a mind, right? So this is where it gets super tricky and weird, that you're doing, not you, the royal you, you're doing this kind of inferencing in the same way you would do it with humans, or sometimes the way we ascribe mental states to our dear dogs, right? That they're happy to see us, or maybe they're just super excited and have to go to the bathroom, right? We assign these mental states to things naturally, but people are still thinking carefully when they're prompted to actually do that kind of thinking. So what does this mean? I don't know yet. I need more grant money to do that, to start answering these questions. But what I will say is that I think the functioning of these mental shortcuts that people take are going to be remarkably important towards the responsible development of AI, because they can be effectively leveraged to get people to buy into something that they might not otherwise. That also means that it's really important for literacy of people who use or interact with different types of technologies. And it's also important as far as a consideration, I think, in policy development, whether and how different types of social machines should be governed in different ways. There's many different directions I think this could go, for good or for ill. And we should be considering all of those weird discrete things that we may not actually be able to see when people engage these kinds of tech. So I would love to have questions if we have time. I don't know that I can answer that question. So the question was, how might the moral mind heuristic have evolved over time now versus 1920? I wasn't around in 1920, and I'm not a student of history. So I'm not entirely sure I could speak to the different types of assumptions that people might have at the time. If we can engage in some historical nostalgia here and think about maybe that time as being of a slower speed, potentially, we might be able to infer that people might be not so prone to make quick judgments. But at the same time, it's a tricky question, because I think if we had the capacity to have that kind of tech, any kind of similar social tech at that time, it might actually be a very different time. There would be a different set of assumptions, a different set of accepted norms. So I am not at all sure. I'm not even sure how to answer that question. That's a great question. Sure. I think it is, I don't know if I can quantify it, but it's both. We have data on that. Looking at, we did this investigation, having people sort of recall their top of mind robot characters from the media. And we had them do it from screen-based media, TV and film, from print media, and from interactive media, video games effectively. And what we saw, so there were some hints that the more you could recall, perhaps the more likely you would be to engage with a robot. Basically, you've seen more of them, so you think it's fine. But what we actually saw is that it's the empathy toward the characters you could recall that matters. If you sympathize with Wall-E and Optimus Prime and R2-D2, then you would be more likely to accept an actual robot when you met one. But we do know that it's a class of inference abilities called theory of mind. It is innate to humans, and it doesn't, okay, I don't want to say innate, because we develop it over time. It really starts to emerge around age 5 and becomes a little bit more sophisticated and trained as you grow into adulthood. So there are certain types of capacities that humans have and move towards through their social training effectively. But part of that social training is the media. Does that help? Great.
So when interacting or designing like technology, how is there a way to kind of filter out those kind of fallacies of what you talked about so that you can think more objectively with those?
As far as the designer goes?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's an interesting question. So the way that we understand biased processing and heuristics is that they are not entirely escapable, but we can train ourselves to be more aware of our tendency to engage them. So I think by being more conscious of, let's say, it's a little tricky because I've been doing it mostly investigating this from the end user or interactant perspective. So, but the short answer would be, I think, by making ourselves more conscious, we can become better at mitigating our own reliance on heuristics. So I'm not sure what that training would look like necessarily for a designer, but by merely making it top of mind, we can do better at that.
So like even for the end users, so for instance, like you're looking through the news and some of it is written by an AI or like it's talking about technology. Is there a way to look at that through an unbiased lens of looking at without heuristics, essentially?
Is there a way to look at media representations in ways that don't make us biased? Is that what I'm understanding? So, sorry, I want to make sure I'm understanding your question correctly. So are there ways that we as people who will interact with these technologies can move ourselves past our biases? Okay, this answer I would suggest would be similar, would be to effectively become more aware of them. And that is that's what I meant actually by the literacy component. As we consume these types of technologies, let us work to be more literate in exactly how they work. And one of the movements around trying to improve that is referred to broadly as explainable AI, right? That is questions around should the machine communicate why and why it's doing things and how it's doing things versus just anthropomorphizing the output, right? So when it makes a restaurant recommendation, why do people recommend restaurants to us? Because they've been there and they taste good, right? But maybe a recommender system is not doing it because it knows that it tastes good, right? But because it is drawing on other assessments from other humans, combining them, evaluating them, and then giving you a recommendation, probably also based on what it knows about you, right? And so it may need to explain something like that and as a way of helping us move past our shortcuts. By it not taking a shortcut, we wouldn't be taking a shortcut. Does that make sense? That can help.